The dust of redemption was a fine, insidious thing. It got into your clothes, your food, your lungs, and, most damningly, into the cracks of your soul where hope used to live. The town was a collection of sun-bleached bones, a forgotten speck on the map where the only thing that flourished was the saloon's cheap whiskey and the undertaker's steady trade. It was a place of last chances, and most men had already used theirs up. For a 12-year-old boy named Elias Thorne, the dust was a constant, grinding presence. He felt it on his tongue as he worked the family's failed claim, a patch of dry earth his father had abandoned to the fever 2 years past. He felt it in his mother's cough, a dry, rattling sound that had become the metronome of his days. The cough was a thief. It stole her color, her strength, and her voice, leaving behind a spectral woman who spent her hours in a faded armchair, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, staring out at the relentless sun. "Eli," she'd whisper, her voice like rustling paper. "Don't you fret. It'll pass." But Elias knew it wouldn't. He'd seen the sputum-stained rags she tried to hide, the way her hand would tremble as she reached for a cup of water. Consumption. The word hung in the air of their one-room shack, as heavy and suffocating as the heat. The only man in 50 miles who could help was the doctor, a whiskey-soaked excuse for a physician named Albright who demanded payment in advance. He wouldn't even look at Clara Thorne without the glint of silver. Elias had sold everything. His father's gold pocket watch, the only memento from a better time, had brought a paltry sum. He'd sold his mother's wedding ring, a thin band of gold that had felt like a betrayal to pry from her finger while she slept. He'd sold the 2 goats that had provided their meager milk and the 1 chicken that had stubbornly laid eggs. Now, the shack was empty of anything of value. All that remained was a pile of dust, a fading mother, and a burning, impotent fury in the boy's heart. He had $3. 3 crumpled, sweat-stained dollar bills he'd found hidden in the lining of his father's old coat. It was a pittance, a mockery of a fortune. It was, he knew, not even close to what the doctor would demand. It was his last hope, and it wasn't enough. That was the Tuesday morning the gunslinger came to town. Elias was at the well, struggling to draw a bucket of brackish water, when the sound of a single, unhurried horse echoed through the silent main street. He looked up, his heart clenching with a familiar, irrational hope. Maybe it was a traveling preacher, a man of God who could offer a prayer, or a rich merchant who might have work. But the figure that materialized out of the shimmering heat haze was neither. The man was a study in dark clothes and darker purpose. His boots were worn but meticulously polished, his black trousers and duster coat stark against the pale, dusty landscape. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, casting his face in perpetual shadow. All Elias could see was a strong jaw, a hint of silver at the temples, and, most prominently, the heavy, oiled leather of the twin Colt revolvers holstered low on his hips. They were tied down to his thighs, a gesture that spoke of absolute, practiced readiness. He rode with a casual, predator's grace, his eyes scanning the town not with curiosity, but with assessment. He was looking for danger, or for a reason to create it. The gunslinger's name, they said, was Silas Kane. He had ridden into redemption on a trail of rumor and blood. Whispers followed him like a faithful dog. He'd killed 12 men before he was 20, shot a U.S. Marshal in a fair fight in Abilene, and once faced down an entire posse single-handedly. No one knew the truth, and in a town like Redemption, the legend was more potent than any fact. He was a devil for hire, a man who dealt in death for a price. He was the worst kind of omen, and yet, the very sight of him stirred something dark and desperate in the townsfolk. They came out to watch, drawn by a morbid fascination, leaving the shadows of the boardwalks and the cool interiors of their shops. Elias, his jug of water forgotten, joined the periphery of the crowd. The gunslinger reined his horse to a halt in the middle of the street, right in front of the saloon. He dismounted with a fluid, controlled movement and hitched his horse. The only sound was the creak of leather and the nervous shuffle of feet on the wooden planks. He stood for a moment, letting the town drink in the sight of him, the very picture of lethal authority. Then he walked into the saloon, the swing doors groaning in protest behind him. The silence he left behind was more profound than the noise that preceded him. For 2 hours, the gunslinger sat alone at a corner table, nursing a single whiskey. He ignored the curious, fearful glances. The bartender, a portly man named Silas, a coincidence that made everyone uneasy, hovered nervously, ensuring the bottle was never empty. No one dared approach him. They had all seen his kind before. He was a predator, and they were all prey. Elias watched from the street, his mother's cough echoing in his memory. A ghost of an idea was forming in his mind, a reckless, insane plan born of pure desperation. This man, this angel of death, could fix things. He could make the problem go away. But the problem wasn't a man or a gang, it was a sickness. The gunslinger's price was a bullet, not a cure. But what if money was the price? With a trembling hand, Elias felt the 3 crumpled bills in his pocket. They felt heavier than gold. An impossible, foolish hope flared in his chest. He knew it was madness. What could a man like Silas Kane want with a sick woman and a penniless boy? Yet, the alternative was to watch his mother slip away, day by agonizing day, until the cough finally stole her last breath. When the gunslinger finally emerged from the saloon, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the street. The crowd had thinned, but a few dozen people remained, unable to tear themselves away from the spectacle of danger. They were like birds hypnotized by a snake. Elias stepped out from the crowd. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He felt 1,000 eyes on him, the collective breath of the town held in suspense. The air was thick with dust and the smell of horses and fear. He walked directly into the path of the gunslinger, his small frame a defiant speck against the man's broad, dark silhouette. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. "Eli! Get back here," a voice hissed from the crowd. It was the blacksmith, a man who'd occasionally given Elias a scrap of food. But Elias didn't listen. He couldn't. The gunslinger stopped. He was even more imposing up close. The shadow of his hat deepened, but Elias could feel the man's gaze on him, cold and curious. A slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head was the only sign of his acknowledgement. "Is there a problem, boy?" The gunslinger's voice was a low, gravelly drawl, devoid of emotion. It was the sound of a stone grinding against a stone. Elias swallowed, his throat as dry as the desert. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the 3 bills, holding them up in his grimy, trembling hand. They were limp and pathetic in the dying light. "Mister," Elias said, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and desperate sincerity. You're a gunslinger. They say you can fix things. Any kind of problem." Silas Kane's lips moved, not quite a smile. "My fee is for dead men, boy. Not fixing things." "Please," Elias pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. "My mother. She's sick. Real sick. The doctor won't come less he's paid. I don't have enough, not near enough." He thrust the bills forward. "I got $3. It's all I got. It's my last, it's everything. Could you please help her? Could you go get the doctor and tell him you'll make sure he gets paid? Tell him you'll vouch for me? Please, mister." A collective, soft gasp went through the crowd. It was a moment of raw, unadulterated pity. The sight of this scrawny boy, offering his last pathetic sum to the most feared man in the territory, was a scene of such profound and tragic absurdity that it felt like a punch to the gut. They saw a boy who didn't understand the world, who mistook a grim reaper for a guardian angel. Silas Kane didn't move. He stared down at the boy, then at the crumpled bills. The silence stretched, agonizing and dense. The only thing that moved was the dust devils swirling at their feet. Everyone watched, their hearts in their throats. The townsfolk who had known Elias his whole life, who had watched his family fall apart, felt a deep, wrenching shame. They had pennies and dimes in their pockets, but they'd always looked away, always had their own problems. For a long, terrifying moment, the gunslinger was utterly still. Then, a slow, almost imperceptible change came over him. The hard lines of his face seemed to shift, just a fraction. The coldness in his eyes flickered, and for the barest instant, Elias saw not a killer, but a man. A man who had seen far too much death, and who carried the weight of it like an invisible cross. He saw, perhaps, a reflection of a past he'd long tried to bury. He reached out, his gloved hand incredibly large. He didn't take the money. Instead, he gently pushed Elias's trembling hand back down to his side. "No," he said, his voice low, the single word somehow softer than before. "Not with this." The crowd fell silent, a world of disappointment and relief. So that was it. The gunslinger wouldn't help. It was a transaction he didn't understand. The boy's last, desperate gambit had failed. Elias felt the world fall away from under him. The last embers of hope died in his chest. He hung his head, the shame and grief a physical weight. He'd failed her. He had nothing left. But then, in a move so unexpected it seemed to freeze time itself, Silas Kane reached into his own coat. He pulled out a thick, worn leather wallet. He opened it, revealing a wad of greenbacks. Without a word, he pulled out a single, crisp $20 bill. He held it out to Elias. "This isn't for a doctor's fee," he said, the gravel in his voice returning. "This is for you. To start over with your ma. To leave this dust hole behind you." Elias stared at the bill, his mind reeling. It was more money than he'd ever seen in one place. His hand moved to take it, but then he stopped. A strange, stubborn defiance flickered in his young eyes. He couldn't allow it. He knew that to take a handout from a man who dealt in death, to be saved by the devil's charity, was a different kind of damnation. He didn't just want her saved, he wanted to have been the one to save her. He wanted to have done it himself, with his own pitiful offering. The rejection felt right, but it wasn't enough. "No, mister," he said, his voice suddenly clear and steady. "I don't want your charity. I was asking for a job. My $3 was my offer. You said it ain't enough. I'm asking you to work for me. If you won't make the doctor come, then I'm asking you to do the next best thing. I'm asking you to help me, how you know how." The crowd shifted, confused. "What are you saying, boy?" the gunslinger asked, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his voice. Elias looked up, his gaze locking with the gunslinger's hidden eyes. "They say you're a man who can solve problems. You're a killer. So I'm asking you to be my killer. I'll pay you my $3, and you will be my vengeance." A collective, horrified murmur went through the watching townsfolk. Vengeance? Against what? They looked around the street, seeing only ordinary people, dilapidated buildings, and dying hope. "Against who?" the gunslinger asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Elias pointed a trembling finger, not at a person, but in a broad, sweeping arc across the silent, shamed faces of the men and women who watched. "Against them," he said, his voice rising with a power that seemed to surge from the very depths of his soul. "Against the whole town. They saw me sell my father's watch. They saw me sell my mother's ring. They saw me beg. And they saw us starving. They have money, they have food, they have medicine, but they did nothing. They let the dust bury us. They watched my mother die, a little bit more, every single day. They have lives they don't deserve. They are my enemies." The town collectively flinched. The air crackled with accusation. Elias, the quiet, hungry boy they'd all ignored, was now a prophet of their own shame. He was naming their collective sin, and the silence in the street was deafening. Silas Kane looked at the boy, then at the townsfolk. He saw the guilt on their faces, the quick, averted gazes. He'd spent his life being a bane to men he deemed deserving of death. He'd been a judge, jury, and executioner for the wicked. But this was something new. He saw a crowd of ordinary, selfish, frightened people who had failed a child. They weren't murderers, but their inaction was a slow poison. $3, Silas repeated, a ghost of a smile finally touching his lips. That's a steep price for the town of redemption. He turned to the crowd, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his left Colt. The threat was not in the gesture, but in the sheer, unadulterated stillness of him. A deadly calm settled over him. The boys made you an offer, he announced, his voice carrying clear and cold across the street. A fair one, I reckon. I'm for hire. And for the next 10 minutes, I'm his man. Elias Thorne has paid me $3 to inflict his vengeance. Now, I have a choice to make. He turned back to Elias. But a gunslinger's duty, boy, is to shoot straight. And I've never killed anyone who didn't have it coming. Tell me, in all this town, is there one man you'd truly have me put a bullet in? One man who deserves to die for what happened to your ma? Elias looked at the crowd, his rage a hot, blinding fire. He wanted to point. He wanted to name the doctor, who was there among them, looking pale and sober for the first time in months. He wanted to point out the banker, who'd refused him a small loan. He wanted to point at the butcher, who'd thrown him out of his shop when he couldn't pay. But as he looked, he saw something else. He saw the blacksmith, a man who'd fed him once, now staring at his own boots, his shoulders hunched in shame. He saw the widow who ran the boarding house, a woman who'd always looked at his mother with a sad, knowing pity. He saw the good people who had been paralyzed by their own despair, just as he had been. His anger began to cool, replaced by a profound, aching weariness. He knew in his heart that none of them were truly wicked. They were just broken, just like him. To ask the gunslinger to kill one of them would make him a murderer, just like the man he'd hired. It would be the same sin, just dressed in different clothes. He shook his head. No, mister. There ain't one. They ain't deserving of a bullet. The townsfolk exhaled, a collective sigh of relief that was almost audible. A few tears were wiped away. A palpable sense of shame hung over them, but a purer one had eclipsed the earlier fear. Silas Kane nodded slowly, a look of grim approval in his eyes. That's wise, boy. Well, I'm paid. And a job's a job. I don't need a bullet to be your vengeance. He turned back to the crowd. All right. You heard the boy. I'm the hired vengeance of Elias Thorne. And my vengeance is a simple thing. It's a plague of shame. I'm going to walk through this town, and I'm going to collect. For every dollar you have, I'm going to collect a little more. He started walking, slowly, deliberately, toward the doctor. The man took a stumbling step back, his face white. But the gunslinger didn't reach for a gun. He reached into his own pocket and withdrew a single silver dollar. He tossed it to the doctor, who caught it in a fumbling, terrified motion. That's for your first fee, the gunslinger said. $1. You'll go to the Thorne place tonight and give the woman a proper examination. You'll do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until she's well. If she's past help, you'll stay with her and make sure she doesn't die in pain. You hear me? The doctor nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Of course. The gunslinger turned to the blacksmith, whose face was pale. You'll find a suitable pair of mules for the boy, he said. One for riding, one for a cart. You'll also have the harnesses and a wagon ready. He moved down the line of bewildered, shamed townsfolk, issuing commands. To the banker, he demanded that Elias's family be given credit at the general store. To the butcher, he ordered a month's supply of salted meat. To the widow, He demanded she make the thorns a proper meal and deliver it that very evening, and to continue to do so as long as needed. It was a strange, surreal procession. The most feared man in the territory was not dispensing death, but compassion, albeit forced. He was robbing them of their selfishness, their complacency, their ability to ignore the suffering right under their noses. He was extracting a tax of decency. When the gunslinger had finished, the town was in a daze. No one had given up much, certainly not what they should have, but for the first time in years, the name, Redemption, didn't seem like a bitter joke. He walked back to Elias, who was standing in the middle of the street, his eyes wide. The gunslinger crouched down so he was level with the boy. He was close enough now that Elias could see his eyes. They weren't cold. They were tired, old, and filled with a sadness that was a century deep. He was a man who had seen too much death, and who was now seeing something he'd long forgotten, life. He reached out, took Elias's hand, and pressed the 3 crumpled bills back into his palm. "Well, boy," he said, the gravel in his voice gone, replaced by a quiet, sincere tone. "It's been a pleasure working for you. You're a good employer." Elias stared at the money in his hand, then back at the gunslinger. "But I paid you." Silas shook his head, a warm, genuine smile finally breaking the stern facade. "You paid me in something far more valuable. You paid me in a morning where I didn't have to be what I am. Keep your money, Elias. You'll need it. Take care of your ma." He rose to his feet, adjusted his hat, and walked back to his horse. He untied the reins and swung into the saddle with the same fluid grace. He looked down at Elias one last time, his eyes a mix of a warrior's respect and a man's compassion. "So long, boy," he said. And with a gentle nudge of his heels, he turned his horse and rode out of town, the way he had come. The setting sun painted his dark silhouette in gold, and he disappeared into the shimmering heat haze, a ghost of legend riding off into the legend. The entire town watched him go, their shame and hope mingling in the dusty air. Then, they began to move, hesitantly at first, then with a new purpose. The butcher went to his shop, the widow to her kitchen, the blacksmith to his forge. Elias Thorne stood alone in the middle of the street, 3 crumpled dollars in his hand and a profound, impossible feeling in his heart. He turned and looked at the shabby, sun-bleached shack that had been his home, and for the first time in a long while, he was not filled with despair. He didn't know if his mother would live. He didn't know what the future held. But he knew the town of Redemption was different. He had changed it, not with a bullet or a demand, but with a desperate, courageous act of faith. And for a boy who had nothing, that felt like everything. That night, for the first time in months, Clara Thorne had a bowl of hot soup and a visit from a sober, shame-faced doctor. The wind picked up, chasing the dust in circles, but the little shack felt a little less empty, and a little less cold. The boy sat by his mother's bedside, his hand in hers, and listened to the sound of her breathing, the sweetest music in the world. He remembered the gunslinger's eyes. He remembered the man who had taken a job he didn't need and fulfilled it in a way no one expected. He had taught Elias a lesson more profound than any act of violence could, that sometimes, true power wasn't about having a gun, it was about having the courage to ask for help, and the wisdom to know what to ask for. And that even in the dustiest corner of the world, in the heart of a forsaken town called Redemption, the smallest spark of courage could light a fire that would chase away the shadows.